such a wide international audience. I am interested in ideas of demography and fertility. And your first question might be, well, what does that have to do with religion? And what I'm going to argue is that it has a very great deal to do. And if you understand certain ideas and certain numbers, it helps you to understand trends in religion in pretty much any country around the world. And I'll particularly talk about a number of examples, a number of situations. Here's the basic argument. We talk a lot about what's called fertility rate, which is the number of children that a typical woman would have in her lifetime. That's a very good guide to population and to lots of other things. It decides the age structure of a society. And what I'm going to argue, it tells you a lot about the religious prospects for that society, issues like religious persecution, religious freedom. So let me explain that. There's a magic number I will be referring to. If a typical woman in her life has 2.1 children, then that society is going to be pretty stable and constant, and the population will remain very steady. If it is far above that, if it is 5 or 6 children per woman, you'll have a young, expanding, and maybe unstable population. And if it's way below that, you'll have an aging society. So just, and we call that number replacement. So is it sub-replacement, whatever. Here's my argument. If a society is very low fertility, it is also low faith. It is much more secular. If a society is very high fertility, it is high faith in the terms of being religiously active. People are very enthusiastic about religion for good or ill. So you often get religious conflict. One of the most important things that has happened in the world over the last 40 or 50 years has been a shift to low faith, low fertility societies, which is affecting different regions of the world in a different way. It begins in Europe. In the 1960s, scholars of Europe started noticing a really interesting phenomenon. The fertility rate was falling very steadily and sharply, most dramatically in Scandinavian countries like Denmark. 2.1 is replacement. These countries were producing 1.5, 1.4. So where are they going to find children? Where are they going to find the people to do the jobs and pay the taxes? Still an interesting issue. And people at the time said, well, this is really interesting, but this is obviously to do with those strange Scandinavian people, and it's to do with Protestantism and its North European culture. And so, but that's it. But it's a local, interesting phenomenon. And then over time, they said, well, no, it's not. It's going to more and more of Protestant Europe. It's all over Protestant Europe. And in the 1970s, it starts hitting Catholic Europe. So some of the countries in the world with the lowest fertility rates now are countries like Italy and Spain, which are 1.2, very, very low fertility rates, very fast aging. And that affects the median age of a society. The median age of Europe, of the European Union these days, is 42. In Africa, which I'll come back to in a moment, it's about 19. That is, because of this change in fertility, we're creating very different worlds, and as I'll suggest, very different religious environments. As fertility rates fall, collapse in Europe, that coincides almost exactly with a major shift to secularization. I'll talk about what the connection is in a moment. Europe in 1960 is still a very religious society. In Amsterdam, which we think of as one of the world's most secular cities, there are miraculous visions of the Virgin. There is a great deal of religious enthusiasm, religious involvement. That collapses and very, very closely follows the fertility decline. During the 1970s and 1980s, we can measure this in lots of different ways. We can measure it by the number of people attending church, the number of people who are having vocations to the Catholic priesthood, by the spread of secular legislation that is very strongly opposed by the churches. In Catholic countries, you get these referenda and debates which approve, for example, divorce, contraception, abortion, same-sex marriage. And now, some of the world's most secular countries in legislation are countries that 40 or 50 years ago were thought of as rock solid, extreme religious Catholic countries. Ireland, Belgium. So the most religious parts of the world have become the most secular parts of the world over the course of about 50 years. What is the connection? Which comes first, the fertility decline or the faith decline? The answer is, I'm not entirely sure, because the two trends go together so closely. You could argue, for example, that fertility decline takes children out of the equation. You no longer have the same forces that bind people to a local religious institution. If you don't have children going to First Communion classes, confirmation classes, whatever, people get more cut off from those institutions. You could argue that it's the faith that declines first, the religious involvement. People have less of an ideology that leads them to have large families. But I want you to think for a moment about this fertility decline and what it means for a society. It means a society with far more old people, far fewer nuclear families. The nuclear family is no longer a normal expectation. Far more unattached, lone younger people. Loneliness becomes much more of a phenomenon. The opportunities and the demands for church and religious ministries become enormous, and they change. If a church is still focused on the idea of young families going to school, they are living in a bygone world, at least in Europe. They need to think of ways of speaking to lone young people, lone old people, the unattached. And by the way, everything I'm saying there is before the pandemic. We're talking about a social and cultural revolution that also manifests in religion. And I don't want to hit you about the head with statistics, but in much of Europe, I often use what I call the rule of 10, which is if you look at religious statistics for involvement in institutions as they were, say, in 1960, divide by 10, and you get a pretty good idea of what they are now. You're talking about an unparalleled historically decline in religious involvement. Fine. So that's Europe. And people called it a European revolution. They talked about Europe being distinct. And then something very strange happened. And as everyone knew, Europe was so distinct from the rest of the world. And the rest of the world had this great thing. Does anyone remember the population explosion that we talked about in the 1960s, when countries like India and Mexico and Brazil had these enormously expanding populations, and Europe would soon be, and the phrase they used was, swamped by these overseas populations? Well, a couple of things happened. First of all, in order to keep its society going, to do the jobs, to pay the taxes, Europeans brought in a great many migrants from high fertility, high faith countries. That resulted in a great amount of growth of newer religious patterns, especially Islam. And people looked at Europe and said, well, thank heavens that is not our situation. They have all these problems, they have all these situations. And then you look at the rest of the world, and the European pattern of low faith and low fertility started becoming almost, but not entirely, global. The countries that are now demonstrating the most rapid Europeanization in terms of low fertility, low faith, are in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. We used to talk about Latin America as the land of the great population explosion. We have some of the fastest falling fertility rates and fastest rising ages of population in countries now like Brazil and Chile and Argentina. We used to have this vision of the global south as characterized by very rapid population growth and fervent religion. Not true, has not been true for many years. Back in 1970, the median age in Latin America was around about 19. It's now about 32. It will soon be much more like a European pattern. We're dealing with a global trend in age. Excuse me, I didn't say entirely global. There are some big exceptions that I will talk about. And that is reflected in a fall, a collapse in institutional religion. Look, I'm sure you've read all the books about Latin America. You've read about the explosion of Protestant churches in Latin America. You know about the growth of Pentecostal churches in a land like Chile, for example. And that's undoubtedly true. Catholic numbers have declined, Protestant numbers have grown. But by far the fastest growing numbers are neither Catholic nor Protestant. They're people who, when you ask them, say they are sin religión. They are no religion. They are nuns, N-O-N-E-S. There are now in Chile considerably more nuns than there are Protestants or Pentecostals. And that is reflected across the continent with a sharp decline in religion, sharp growth in people who are not necessarily atheist, but they are secular by orientation. They do not go to a church or a religious institution. They probably believe in God. They might even pray, but they have nothing to do with institutions. And most crucially, they do not support religion when it comes to legislation. If you have a survey or an election or a referendum over same-sex marriage, then that secular opinion will win. A low fertility society, like most of Latin America now, is a secular society. Well, I can talk a lot more about this, but let me emphasize the areas where this trend is affecting. And some of them I find very surprising, and I think you may find them surprising. Let me tell you about one country in particular. In the mid-1980s in this country, a typical woman in her life had 7.5 children. It was one of the highest fertility rates in the world. And that country has gone in just 30 years from 7.5 to 1.5. And you think, well, my word, what is this country? It's Iran. Some of the fastest falling fertility rates in the world are found in the Islamic world. We often have a stereotype, I believe, which portrays Europe as being this aging, low fertility state society, which is about to be overwhelmed by these hordes, excuse the stereotypes, from the Islamic world and the Islamic Middle East. If you look at much of the Islamic world, not all of it, it is becoming European. And so you look at Iran and you think, well, you can't say Iran is becoming secular. Well, actually, you honestly can. Not long ago, the Revolutionary Guard in that country, which is the most extreme and kind of fanatical organization, the head of the Revolutionary Guard made an interesting comment. He said that the country has 60,000 mosques, of which about 3,000 are ever used, even for holidays and feasts and great celebrations. Where you can get any sense of people's actual religious views, you get a very high proportion of what we in the West would call nuns. That does not emerge in what the government says or thinks, because the government represents basically itself. Were you to have a genuine free election in a country like Iran, I think it would emerge as an extremely secular and European country. If that's true, there are some other interesting examples in the world. I know another country that 25 years ago, had a fertility rate of 7.0, and that's now down to 2. And you think, what is this? Saudi Arabia. We think of Saudi Arabia as a fast-growing population, very high fertility, very high faith. It's not high fertility. It's now 1 replacement. What does this mean for coming years? And that rate is falling very fast, by the way. Can we imagine a secular Saudi Arabia? It almost hurts even to utter the sentence because it's so improbable. But to take another society in the area, if you look at the Arab Gulf countries, if you look at countries like the United Arab Emirates, extremely low fertility, European figures. So how do they do the jobs? How do they pay the taxes? Well, of course, they bring in immigrants, especially from the Indian subcontinent. They bring in Muslims from Pakistan, and they bring in a great many Christians from South India and from the Philippines. As a result of that, the Arab Gulf now has a Christian population of around 10%. It's gone from virtually 0 to 10% over the space of 50 or 60 years. So just as Europeans are worried about immigration bringing in Islam, the Arab Gulf has acquired a Christian population, which is larger than the Muslim population in Europe. And driving this are issues of fertility and demography. Saudi Arabia has a very substantial Christian population, which it will not acknowledge the existence of. Different estimates say 7%, 10%. The official figure is 0, but we need not care about that. We're seeing something very interesting around the world. And I say this very crudely. If you tell me the fertility rate of a country around the world, I will make a very good guess, a very good estimate as to how strong organized institutional religion is in that country, how likely that country is to be tolerant on secular issues such as same-sex marriage. Am I going to be perfect on my estimates? No, certainly not. But I can give you a pretty good estimate. And I can also look at countries which 30 years ago were at the heart of the population explosion debate that are now down to replacement rate and falling very fast, and think, so where are they going to be in 10 years? The Philippines is now just above replacement. Mexico is just above replacement. I still meet people and even scholars who have this vision, and it's often a very sort of racially driven vision of Europe being overwhelmed by these huge populations from the third world. Those huge populations from the third world, and please hear that in quotes, aren't there anymore. And it's an interesting thought. Europe has brought in a great many people from the Middle East as migrants. Many of them are Muslim. Those are the countries with some of the fastest falling fertility rates in the world, in countries like Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia. Where do you find your migrants if you can't find them there? And my suggestion is countries like France will be drawing in ever more people from Christian Africa. So how Europeans imagine migration has to be thought and rethought. By the way, I've talked about the Islamic world. The country that actually had the fastest falling rate in the Islamic world is Tunisia. And about 15 years ago, a leading demographer made a prediction based on this. And he said, you know, Tunisia is going to be the heart of a great reform movement away from Islam and authoritarianism. And the man was literally laughed at professional meetings. Roll the film forward to 2011. What country was the heart of the Arab Spring? Tunisia. And this gets connected with so many other things. And by this point, you're sitting there and you're saying, why is Jenkins missing the obvious point? So much of what I'm talking about here is changes in the role of women. This is a women's revolution. It's about women being drawn into professions and higher education. Many of them are no longer prepared to have 6 or 8 children. They simply cannot do so. And it might be the fertility rate, the decline in faith are connected with directly with this. They probably are. But what I'm saying is the fertility rate is one way of measuring this. It's not the cause of everything. Whatever you're interested in business, in finance, in economics, in marketing, in retailing, this demographic shift is enormously important for understanding the world presently. I've talked about declining rates. There are some exceptions and they are crucial. To give a long story short, there is one great area in the world that has absolutely resisted this fertility decline so far, and that is Africa. And as a response, as a result of that, most of Africa, the great majority of Africa, remains an extremely high fertility and high faith society. Many implications. It means, for one thing, that the relative African share of global population will rise very steadily as this century goes on. Probably in 1900, there were around 100 million Africans. By 2050, there will be about 2.2 billion, probably 2.5 billion, and that number will grow steadily as the century goes on. In religious terms, it means that African Christians will represent an ever larger share of the global Christian population. And because of migration, they will be ever more important to the Christian communities in Europe and in the United States. And by the way, Muslims are also growing very rapidly in Africa. African Islam will be a very major force in that way. So much of the world's religious story in the coming 40 or 50 years will be an African story. And demography is driving that, relative demography, the stability or decline in other parts of the world, and the still continuing rise in Africa. Again, many political implications to that, religious implications. A high fertility society, a very high fertility society, tends to be very young. It has what we call a youth bulge, that is a great many people between the ages of 15 to 24. The good news about that is young communities like that are very responsive to enthusiastic, passionate religion, deep involvement in religious life, willing to respond to crusades and revivals. The bad news is a society with youth bulge tends to be unstable and often violent. And in the world today, the absolute highest fertility rates are usually found in the African Sahel, in countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, and many of the countries that, as I think we all know, are really troubled by a great deal of violence and guerrilla warfare and failed states and so on. So The African story is different. Some of the fertility rates are astonishing by the standards of the rest of the world, and that is fundamental part of looking at the story of the next few decades. And you may well ask, will African rates decline? Yes, of course they will. But even if they decline in 20 or 30 years, that cohort of young people is still there. And this will not prevent Africa being by far the most Christian continent by 2050, when for the first time there will be over 1 billion Christians on one continent, and that will be Africa. By the way, that does not include the African diaspora, does not include people of African origin in Latin America or Europe or wherever. Okay, let me move to one other topic. And I know I'm doing a very rapid survey here. I hope we can talk a lot about these things in questions. I've talked about countries that have high or low fertility rates. Countries are not united. And many countries around the world have differential rates of development. You can have a country where you have a prosperous, economically advanced, dynamic, urbanized area with very low European fertility rates. In the same country, you can have large rural areas with very high fertility rates. Often, that correlates very closely to religion. The progressive urban populations tend to be very secular. Cities often tend to be secular. The rural areas are extremely religious. And there are some countries in the world, some critical countries, where the, what shall I say? I'm trying to avoid the word clash, but yes, the clash between those two very different kinds of community comes to be politically important. Imagine if you had a government and you have those two communities. You have a progressive, urban, low fertility society and a high fertility religious community. Where do you turn your support to? Well, many people would say you will go for the people who have the votes, the large numbers of people who are more religious. And I give you a couple of examples. Turkey, for example, notionally has a fertility rate that is around replacement. Within Turkey, you have areas to the west that are completely European, that are basically Danish, that have rates of maybe 1.2, 1.3, and they're very secular. In the south and east of the country, you have rural and far less developed areas with rates of 4.5, very high fertility, very religious. If you show me the fertility rate of a particular state in Turkey, it gives me an excellent idea as to how that state is going to vote and how it's going to respond to the very Islamist politics of the government in power in Turkey, the AKP, under Mr. Erdogan. Erdogan has been playing demographic politics. He draws his votes from the, what we might call the Quran belt, like the Bible belt in the United States, these very high fertility, very religious society who want Turkey to be a more religious nation. If you want to understand Turkey, you understand that there are two communities within Turkey, both quite high fertility, and he wants to persuade the Turks to move to ever higher fertility, to have ever more children, to outnumber the Kurds. He sees this as an existential issue. If you do not pay attention to those demographic fertility issues, it means two things. First of all, you will have no idea whatever of why the Turkish government behaves as it does. And secondly, if you are so neglectful of those factors, it probably means you work for the US State Department, because they have systematically ignored those demographic features, which I think for but many of us are so basic, they're axiomatic. The other country I would point to in this way that has radically different fertility rates is India. Many Westerners still have a sense of India in terms of the population explosion stereotypes that existed in the 1960s, 1970s, when India had a fertility rate of approximately 6 children per woman, 6.0, very, very high fertility. That has changed radically. That is now a little above replacement, but you have extreme differences between and among states of infertility. Half the states of India are now well below replacement. Some are actually Danish in the, Scandinavian in their numbers. Others are much more traditional high fertility societies. The high fertility states are the ones which are also associated with the more Hindutva, Indian nationalist, Hindu nationalist policies. We are looking at Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh. Again, a map of fertility will give you quite a good idea of the support for different parties, and particularly for Mr. Modi in recent elections. The politics of religion, of religious identity, of religious nationalism are often rooted in high fertility, in demography. So I'm suggesting really quite a complex series of implications here, and India and Turkey are just two of the examples. The other country which is very interesting is Israel. Israel is politically a Jewish nation. Jewish communities are radically divided between different kinds of faith, which corresponds almost perfectly to fertility. If you are a secular Jew and you might be associated with the Reform tradition, you will probably have an extremely low Scandinavian style fertility rate. The Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox have some of the highest fertility rates in the world, 6.5, for example. And the implications of this is that, first of all, Prime Minister Netanyahu has survived for a great many years, despite repeated scandals, by being able to rely on those conservative, high fertility populations. It also means in the long run that Israel is becoming much more religious in its politics, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. That might be good, that might be bad, but my point is, without the demographic dimension, it really makes little sense. So to pull this together, assume for the sake of argument that what I'm saying is correct there. What are some of the implications for the kind of interests we may have, the kind of work that we may do? Obviously, very different in different parts of the world. For Europeans, for people in a country like Great Britain, for example, one of the implications is we are dealing with a radically different society, not just because it is, quote, secular, but because the kind of communities we are serving, we're trying to organize outreach to, have very different needs from what their parents or grandparents did, and churches have to adapt accordingly. Let me stress, I'm not suggesting that these, quote, low faith societies, unquote, are necessarily atheist. What it means is they're separated from institutional and organized religion. Often there is quite a high level of what you might call faith activity. A great many Europeans who are very secular in the way they don't go to churches are passionately involved in pilgrimage. We live today in the golden age of European pilgrimage while the churches are abandoned. It suggests that there is material there for Christian churches to build on, but they have to adapt their policies accordingly. For one thing, Europe increasingly is going to have by far the oldest society known in human history, with a huge number of people in their 80s, 90s, and older. What are the needs? What are the opportunities for churches in that world? It also means in other communities, they are moving towards this situation. The good news is they have more notice that this situation is coming. How do they adapt? If you are interested in the political issues, critical issues of religious freedom, religious persecution, I would suggest to you that demography is a very important analytical tool and a predictive tool. It helps you understand trends as they are developing. It helps you understand the reasons and the background for a government or a group having particular policies. How one responds to this, we can discuss. But I would suggest that this is a major force driving religious conflict, where you have two or more religious communities which are socially, demographically so different. That does a lot to explain the clash. Now, what I'm absolutely not trying to do is to offer a one-size-fits-all explanation that this is Jenkins's magic number. It clearly is not. What I'm saying is that I am observing a correlation that seems to work well and seems to offer a good analysis. For anyone interested in the United States and what has been described quite aptly as its never-ending election from hell, there is actually a remarkably good correlation if you look at fertility rates and rates of religious participation, which is very good as a prediction for partisan loyalties. I would be very interested next week to see whether this continues to be true. High fertility states tend to be Republican, low fertility states tend to be religious and tend to be less religious and democratic. Low fertility states have far larger proportions of nuns. The proportion of nuns in the United States has grown. So the US now has three main religious communities numerically: evangelicals, Catholics, and nuns. And the nuns are moving very rapidly to become the largest. And again, if you map the growth of the nuns, it correlates so nicely with the fall in the US fertility rate, which is now at or below that of Denmark. Now, perhaps the most interesting thing for me is how counterintuitive so much of what we're looking at here is in terms of people's stereotypes. There are still intelligent people who will look at a country like, as I say, India, and think in terms of, oh yes, third world population profile. Not anymore. Not anymore. 50 years ago, yes. That shift is crucial to so much. So that's why I believe that fertility is a very important marker for understanding faith. And the subtitle of my book was the demographic revolution that is transforming all the world's religions. And I would come back to that. If you're interested in Buddhism, if you're interested in Islam, any major religious tradition, you have to look at that dimension. One thing I found is that when you are on Zoom, you are really testing the patience of audiences if you speak at the length that you would if you're going face to face. Interaction works better. So with your permission, I will wind up my presentation at that point, and I will throw open for any questions or debate or cries of nonsense. Thank you very much.
Well, you do a very good job, Dr. Jenkins, of sharing via Zoom. It's not easy to do, but very engaging. Such an interesting topic, and I think something that's so relevant as you address the way that this is seen all over the world, how this is playing out in countries all over the world. And we have so many people from these countries that you're speaking of. So we're excited to open it up for questions. Paul had a good question here. What do you make of demographers' maps of Europe, the countries like Sweden and Germany that have rising fertility from new immigrants, perhaps many Muslim, and declining fertility among native-born citizens?
Right. Well, as I said, that's the classic model. And the interesting issue is how long those rising rates among immigrants will continue, because there's a lot of evidence that over a generation or so, immigrants tend to adopt the social and demographic habits of the host population. So in the United States right now, to use an analogy, Latin fertility rates are among the fastest falling, and in Europe, Muslim populations who've been around for 40, 50 years now have very standard European fertility rates. And the very high rates are associated with extremely recent populations, often people who came in as asylum seekers. So that division is strong, but there is always that drawing towards a common mean. And what that means is, for societies to continue, you need ever larger populations of new people to do the jobs and pay the taxes. So it means ever-growing diversity and globalization.
Okay, another question. How do fertility rates relate to automation, such as self-driving cars, automated grocery checkout lines, and the possibility or the possible future of reduced employment? What does it mean for religion?
Boy. If somebody wants to go away and write that book, that is such a wonderful idea. Most of the trends that the questioner is raising there happen after the fertility shifts that I am discussing. The most important trend is actually a more fundamental one, which is the shift away from industry to services from the 1970s onwards. That provides a great deal more women's employment. It means smaller family size, and that's part of the larger picture. One thing that really does interest me by way of employment is my book came out in, July. And obviously I take no account of the pandemic. I take no account of the enormous impact that will have on unemployment patterns and fertility. My argument would be, and we can talk about this, that in the United States and Europe, the next decade is going to see fertility falling to still lower depths and to a real crisis of secularization within the United States, which has not hitherto been used to it. So I would link the economic side to that. I think it's going to be a very perilous time for churches and religious institutions of all kinds.
Okay. Tete was saying, thanks, Dr. Jenkins. I was wondering what power play you envision by 2050 from Africa relative to the billion Christians projection.
Yeah. Well, one thing I can look at this in all sorts of different ways. One of the fundamental facts in the Christian world is that so much of the money and power and soft power is concentrated still in Europe and the United States, while the numbers are concentrated in the South. We're talking about a huge gulf in that way. One prediction I would make, I'm very interested in the Roman Catholic Church, which was really the first institution of any kind in the world to deal with globalization. And it's sometimes said that the main problem that church faces is that the Vatican is situated 2,000 miles too far north. The growth of numbers of Catholics in Africa, especially, just Africa, is phenomenal. I don't think there are going to be many more white European popes. I think that we are probably due for a series of African and Asian Asian popes, but I think the Catholic Church will be one of the great venues for discussion and debate about that issue. And we've already seen this, of course, notoriously in the Anglican Communion, where issues of sexuality and morality highlighted the gulf within that communion of contracting or even vanishing numbers in Europe and North America versus the enormous growth in Nigeria and Kenya and other nations. And in a sense, I would see that as the first battle in a series of wars that will affect most Christian denominations over the next 30 or 40 years.
That's great. Any other questions that you guys have? Herto said, we used to have priests from Europe back in the 90s come, and he lives in Indonesia,
Yep.
and spread the gospel, while now we send out many Indonesian priests.
Exactly. If you go to Europe these days, within the Catholic Church, many rural parishes have basically closed or been grouped into numbers of maybe 10 or 15 parishes served by priests from sometimes Nigeria, sometimes Vietnamese. But while vocations have collapsed in Europe, so they have been very strong. I read the newspaper of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Los Angeles in this country, one of the largest archdioceses. And every so often they print pictures of the newly ordained priests. And obviously 30 years ago, this was almost entirely made up of white Anglo men. And now it's fairly equally divided between Koreans and Mexicans and Nigerians. And occasionally there might be an Irish American, but he is very much in the minority. Increasingly, the priesthood in Western nations is becoming a global South phenomenon, which is not entirely, but largely a consequence of this shift. By the way, Indonesia is another example of a country with one of the very steep falls in fertility. What is it? Indonesian fertility is about 2.3, 2.4 now, down from, I think, 7.
Yeah, and Paul had one other question too, asking about when we look at the low fertility rates in the US and elsewhere, do we see more religious people having more of the kids and therefore representing larger percentages of the population in the future?
Yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon, and that's certainly what's happened within the Jewish community worldwide. And it really has resulted in a significant shift towards more orthodox, more conservative religion. People predict this is going to happen or observe this happening in the US and Europe, and to a limited extent it does. But it's on a much more marginal scale than it is within the Jewish world. So I can point to, for example, evangelicals and Catholics and so on. But I think the great time of that phenomenon has gone. I would argue that it was maintaining those relatively higher fertility rates that accounts for a large degree of what was seen as the evangelical growth in the US over the last 30, 40 years. But those evangelical and Catholic populations, even the more conservative ones, are now accommodating to more of a secular norm. So much as I would like to believe that the conservative Catholics, conservative evangelicals are going to save the day with their very large and homeschooled families, they'll have some impact, but they will not transform or reverse that very powerful trend.
Another element in Europe is the parental benefits and leave policies. Most of the OECD countries pay families to have kids. How does that affect the fertility religion dynamics?
We talk about natalist policies, governments who try and encourage child raising. My observation when countries try to do this is it can make a little impact in slowing the drift, slowing the decline, but not much. I know a country like Hungary, for example, is presently discussing various natalist ideas. The problem is, in order to make any serious difference, you just have to invest such a very large amount for not much payback. So generally speaking, I would say that natalism does not really work in that way. The other area that is trying this very hard is Arab Gulf countries are trying to reverse their very low fertility. Same picture. They have a huge amount of money to invest and they're doing it, but it's just not producing enough of a payback to make a difference. So it slows the decline. It does not reverse the decline. There are some strategies that do work, but they are so repressive and even violent that they really should not be considered by any civilized country.
But the Amish and Mormons are booming in the US from a fertility standpoint, right?
The Amish are doing very well. The Mormons, again, if you look just in the last few years, are moving towards accommodating the secular norm. So very high fertility rates traditionally were a big factor. But particularly over the last decade or so, they've shared in an American fertility drop, which is one of the most important features in contemporary American society that really remarkably few people have picked up on. And incidentally, the great thing which launched that drop, if you can launch a drop, I may be mixing my metaphors, was the 2008 financial crisis. And it makes me wonder when I see the 2020 crisis, whether that would be the same, only more intense. But Mormons too are moving towards the norm. Again, the thing about Amish, and I live in an area where I'm surrounded by many Amish, and they are completely wonderful people. There are only about 200,000 in the whole United States. If they had an enormous population boom over the next few years, what could they get up to? 500,000? And that's in a country of 320 million people. So they're so marginal that they don't really make that much impact.
Okay, Herto had another question. With the ever-changing political situation right now, many people play religious issues rather, to attract more voters for certain candidates, even in countries with low faith. Do you think that kind of political issue could help grow the faith there?
Boy, see, one of my interesting things there is that when parties, governments try to do that, they're often speaking to different audiences. So a country may have overall low faith, but it's divided between kind of high and low faith, high and low fertility communities, and it's who they're actually speaking to. I genuinely, I think a policy like that, and again, I think of India, for example, if a government is being very accommodating to Hindu interests, that it's really doing things at the expense of other religions, then that can consolidate and build Hindu loyalties of a very conservative kind. What Netanyahu is doing in Israel is undoubtedly helping consolidate Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox views. The problem is that it tends to be a very divisive phenomenon in that the religious support you are winning on one side, you're also creating a very strong anti-religious secularizing trend in the other. And the example I keep citing there is Iran, where the government tries very hard to promote religion, and by doing so, it's probably created one of the most secular and anti-clerical populations anywhere in the Islamic world. I could tell many anecdotes about that, but I won't right now. I just satisfy myself by saying, oh, if they ever had a real election in Iran, it would be a very interesting phenomenon.
Eric had a question. Are there places in the world where the replacement theory is taking place for fertility reasons, like a community replacing others because it grows quicker?
Okay, I don't quite understand that. I'm sorry.
If I can explain, I was thinking,
please.
You know, I remember a few years ago, we were speaking about in Israel, you know, two states, like the Jewish state and then a Palestinian state, and others were saying from the Arab community were saying, no, we must keep only one state, but we Arab community, you know, we must do so many kids that one day there will be more Arab than Jews. I'm speaking about something that is not violent, like the Rohingyas, something. This is why, for example, I'm reading. I don't know if they are right, but some people in Europe, they say, okay, Europe is basically Christian, Catholic or Protestant, whatever. But then, would it be possible one day, you know, to have more Muslim population? And what could that change? The replacement is more on that side. You know, you have more kids, so one day, well, 10 years ago, that was a Christian country, and then suddenly it's a Muslim or Buddhist or whatever. Is that happening somewhere?
Boy, I would give you one very good example of that, and it's a small country, but it's very interesting in terms of demography and politics, and that is what happened in the nation of Lebanon, for example. In the 1930s and 40s, there were a couple of very large groups, one Christian, one Muslim, and they basically divided the country between them, and they shared out all the offices and so on. But over time, other groups, less powerful, very high fertility groups, grew so rapidly that they outnumbered those old traditional elites. And the result was the Lebanese civil war in the 70s and 80s. And so, for instance, the Shia Muslims went from being a tiny population back in the 1930s and 40s to certainly the largest community by the end of the century. So that wasn't the replacement of Muslims by something else, but one kind of Muslim by another. So yes, certainly that can happen over time, and it can happen quite rapidly. When you mention Europe, by the way, that's quite interesting. Muslim numbers are growing, but they're still pretty small. In Europe, you're probably talking about what, maybe 5% of the population. My interest,
depending on the countries, no, doctor. There's some countries more or less. Yes.
Of course. In fact, the country with the highest proportion, incidentally, of Muslims is Russia, which is a very interesting phenomenon. But what I was going to say is, in Western Europe, at least, so much of the immigration we see from the global south is Christian. You know, you go to Paris and you go to these areas and you're told, oh, these are all Muslim immigrant areas. And then you see all the Nigerian run churches, and you see the churches from Cameroon and Madagascar and so on. There are a lot of Christian immigrants, and I think that number will grow. If you go to England, African migration is huge, and it's overwhelmingly Christian. So short answer to a very good question. Can you get a religious replacement? Yes. Are you going to see it in most of Europe? Probably not. The country that is very, very interesting in that way is Russia, where incidentally Muslims are disproportionately represented within the armed forces. So there are projections that by mid-century.
So that would be, Doctor, that would be in the eastern part of Russia, maybe, those part of
Caucasus, chiefly Caucasus and eastern areas as well. But the populations are growing very fast, and there are now very substantial Muslim populations in great cities like Moscow, for example.
Well, that's interesting, but you always think about Orthodox, no? I mean, you think Russia, you think Orthodox, and.
But see, I think that's what's interesting about that is if you want to understand Vladimir Putin, he is extremely conscious of this demographic phenomenon. And his response to the growth of Islam is we must strengthen Orthodox Christianity. We must strengthen this kind of Russian Christian identity. So again, his religious politics are rooted in demography.
Wow.
I see, that's the response I want. Wow, thank you.
That's the perfect response, right? Great questions, Eric. Thank you.
Question.
Thank you all for your questions and participation. And thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for sharing this. We did put a link, I'll put it back in again, just for those who may have missed it. Also want to just show the cover of the book for people to see when they go online, hopefully to purchase one. Fertility and Faith, the Demographic Revolution and the Transformation of World Religions. So I'll put the link again in the chat for anyone who's interested in that. But Dr. Jenkins, thank you so much. We've been wanting to have Dr. Jenkins join us for a few years now. And this is not exactly what we were expecting. We thought we'd be in St. Petersburg together, but this is great to be able to have our brothers and sisters all over the world joining us virtually. So thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for your time.
Thank you very much.
Also, could we ask Dr. Jenkins and the group here, if the recording is good enough, I'm wondering if we could edit this to post on our podcast. Sure. And so first, if Dr. Jenkins is okay with that, and if anybody else, I think Melissa was asking all the questions, so I think everybody should be, is okay with it. But please speak up if you're not okay with that.
I'm very happy with that. I would kindly ask you to send me the link when it does go up, but yes.
Absolutely, wonderful, and thank you.
That's fantastic. Well, Dr. Jenkins, you're welcome to stay on for the remainder. You're welcome to hop off too. So, whatever works for you, but it's been great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will say goodbye and have a wonderful rest of your event here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it was fantastic. You guys, we can't tell you how much it's meant to us to have you be a part of this time together. We didn't know, if it would work. It's always hard to coordinate times, schedule when you're dealing with people all over the world, literally. But this seems to be a good time for us to connect. And we just so appreciate your being here each day and sharing. We're thinking of different ways we could connect at the end. We thought we might break into breakouts and have you share, but I think we might just open up if anybody has anything that either, we'd have to be very brief, but anything quickly that you learned, or also just, how we can be praying for you as far as like with your work right now. We're thinking maybe even doing, if it interests you, we wanted to see if this might be something that would interest you, is to do like a once a month Zoom meetup where we don't necessarily have a speaker per se, but we just come on and chat and catch up and encourage one another, share story ideas. I love hearing about Josephine and Rachel doing their mentoring, because that's so much of what our heart is with the Pointer program, is that you'll go out, take what you've learned and go back to your places of work and lead from where you are and mentor. So we love hearing those stories. And I think hearing about how people are doing that well and what's working will help the rest of us do that well in our own workplaces. So would a monthly meetup be something that would interest you guys? Thumbs up. Yeah, I think that would be really good.
Maybe if we could hear, some comments from people, on what they would like to do or what needs they have that we could meet. If we did that kind of a meetup on Zoom, because we want to be, I think with the Media Project, we want to provide communications, events, and opportunities that are needed and desired by the members, and not just created for the sake of creating those. Mm-hmm. So what are the sort of needs that you all have? What would you like to see or do, or to have as part of those kinds of meetups. And and also maybe just to share a little bit of our thinking about next year. I personally kind of expect the pandemic to continue in a way that I don't know. I sort of want to hope we get surprised and can offer something in person next year, but I'm kind of expecting that flights and visas and travel may not be restored even through 2021. So I think we'll sort of plan to have Europe or EJI online in Prague, Logi, OpG, Pointer. We'll probably plan to have those digital, kind of like we're doing like this program, some kind of adjusted digital. So I say that as background so you know that we will plan to have those programs which you and your friends and networks can apply to and participate. Okay, so then to think about on top of that, this idea that Melissa's proposing and offering some kind of a monthly meetup, is that still needed? And if Melissa does offer that, what are the kinds of needs that we can meet or provide through that?
Well, Prof, can I say something to that?
Sure, Josephine.
Yes, you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Prof. and Melissa. For us Kenyans, and I speak on behalf of the big group that are here, Rachel Nakitare, Josephine Wareta, and Cecilia Mwenda, we are doing mentorship for journalists in university, students who are pursuing media and journalism in public universities. And we are using the information and the teachings we got from Pointer in the various times we came there. And we feel like we need some refresher of sorts, even if it's some notes and some tips on how to continue getting the most out of this program during these COVID times when we really are not meeting with the girls physically. So we would really appreciate that we get more information, more tips, ways on how to mentor these girls so that they can get the most out of this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think a refresher could be really good. Going back through the points that we learned at Pointer together. I like that. Other needs, what are some other things that you guys feel like if we could address? Giselle says TMP could share with us monthly meetings to share journalist stories that can help us improve our career. So maybe some testimonials of journalists sharing their stories. Okay, Jennifer, yes. Oh, Jennifer, you're muted.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Lisa, can you hear me now?
Yes,
So I was thinking that if we're going to have this monthly meeting, I think it would be very useful to everyone if they can actually talk about what they're working on, and if there was any real major problem to cover a particular story. And then as Lucy's talking about news presentation, then they can come up with, kind of what is their problem specifically, how can they get around it? Is there a way that, Paul or any of the other people could actually advise them, and that this is a way you could, get around your problem, the issue. I think that could be quite a helpful little thing that we could actually bring up every month, Melissa, because people would have specific problems for their specific countries, their specific topics that they might be covering at the time. I think it might help.
yeah, that's great. And thank you for pointing that out. Lucy's comment was, if everybody can, sorry.
Melissa?
Just 1 second. Oh, sorry. Hold on 1 second. Just 1 second there. I don't know who's muted. Oh, here we go. Okay. No, but I think that could be really, really good. And Lucy's point about, since the new presentation is so important, that to your point, Jennifer, I think that's great. So Carolina.
Yes, Melissa, I would like to make a comment.
Oh, sure, Jacob.
Okay, I concur with your proposal that the monthly engagement, I think this will go a long way in keeping up the spirit of networking and collaboration, so that the ideas for which the platform was created cannot die down, because I think it would be a good thing for people to share their experiences from their respective countries and regions in terms of what is happening in the immediate environment. So I strongly concur with your proposal for the monthly engagement. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jacob. That's great to know. Carolina, too, I know you had your hand raised as well as Eric. So I'll ask Carolina first. And then
Hi, everybody. Yes, according to what Jennifer said, it's important for us, like in different areas in the world, in Latin America, we have different issues. For example, I still wanted to ask Paul Marshall other things that affect us more than Islam, for example, but it was a different subject. So probably if we in South America could add more of these other issues and tell you guys so we can cover those issues, that would be great. For example, gender ideology here in South America is a big issue in education, and most media, the way they cover it is pro this agenda. So it's an issue for us, Christian or more religious journalists, to cover this. So this would be a good issue for us.
That's such a good point. Yeah, if we could, and by having the meetings, maybe we could even share at each one, looking ahead to other ideas for the next ones, because issues may come up as the year goes on. Oh, sorry, just one second. Eric had a question, and then I see Herto and Tete too, but Eric, what was yours?
Agreed with Carolina. I think every continent should have particular issues that would be interested for the media of those zones. In my case, I would have two interests. I'm a teacher of journalism. I coordinate the career of journalism. So it's for my students, I think it would be very, very, very useful for them to understand that you cannot cover so many themes, political, if you take religion out of that. What happened in the States, what happened in so many countries of the world, you cannot explain so many geopolitical stuff without, if you choose not to speak about religion. So that's something that, and we did that in St. Petersburg when we came with so many great teachers or lecturers. So that would be great for my students. So, sometimes to say, kids, you have to understand that religion has to be covered. So that would be great, some kind of a conference for them, for the students, and regularly, because of course my students change every four years. Every year I have new students, so it would be very interesting. And the other point, and that's really the TMP heart or DNA. And the other point, it's just about what happened now. I mean, we need to, all the help we can get about entrepreneurship, new business models, what is happening. We are trying to push. I have created a new class in our career, which is media entrepreneurship, because we need our students to have a project when they graduate. Something that they will do or not. We don't, but they need so many things change. In Ecuador, I'm sure in all countries, so many medias are closing. Are closing or passing on the web. We have dozens, not to say hundreds, of journalists being laid out. This kind of stuff. So anything about entrepreneurship, creation of web native media, new economical models would be, I guess, very useful for everybody. That would be my 2 points.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? We're all facing similar, it doesn't matter where we are in the world, we are facing, very similar challenges in journalism right now. So I think it's a great time for us to all come together on that. Tete, you had something.
Okay, so I was looking through the lenses of Josephine for the mentorship. As I said before, we lead a lot of young journalists. So I'm really, really looking forward to the mentorship aspect of it, that we can do our own training in our institutions. Now, the first few batches of fellows that you people had, we were not involved in it. And luckily we had this virtual training that we're fortunate to be a part of. I appreciate it so much. But we would like to have some of the lessons from the training that we can build up and to speed with. I was just thinking about that.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah, and here in Liberia right now, we are heading to elections, and Right now, as I speak to you, one of my staff is in hiding because of threats. So how do we deal with all these things? These are things that we kind of worry about every day as and I know Jacob is calling back because he's here in Liberia too. And I think he can relate too.
Wow. Thank you. Herto, you had something.
Yeah, Melissa. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to join this program. It means a lot for me. I mean, like, I don't think I am as good as anybody else here. So I think this program is very good. I've got a lot of things as inspiration. And that is why I would second what Ma'am Jennifer Arnold said, that this would be good if we do it monthly. Since I think, I don't know if this is right to say it, but with the mobile phone in everybody's hands, everybody can be like, could be journalists in reporting every single day situation or things that happening around us. So I think this kind of program can help us to understand how to be, good journalists. Like me myself, I'm not a journalist, but I could learn to be a good journalist, and hopefully I can help inspire other people from this kind of activity. So I hope that after this I can go back to my community, since I am leading this English language service center. Hopefully with the things that I do, I can help share a good message. And one more thing, if we do it monthly, this could be our community, international community, where we can share things that happen in our country that not always get publicity from our journalists, because sometimes journalists are very biased with political background and their own interest and many things. So I think this could be a room and platform for us to share that kind of thing. And hopefully, if this is one of my suggestion too, if this is possible, maybe we can have a like WhatsApp group, so like we have like continue daily conversation too, if it's possible. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jennifer, yes.
Yeah. Melissa, you remember that citizen journalism course that Vishal and I taught at. I think that you were putting together some module or a capsule about that. I think that perhaps might tie in very much with what Herto is talking about. I know it was for citizen
Who did do all
journalists.
that one, Seth?
I was just wondering about that. Is that happening? When? Whatever.
Yeah, no, that's great. And the needs are so great, right? There's so much, and we'll just be able to do little by little. But it's a great point to use resources we already have and people we have. A couple of other things in chat that were really good. Elias was saying he'd like more support guidance on how to use various properties in the digital space, like podcasts, make digital offerings more vibrant, impactful, to mitigate against the decline in print. Great point. Lekan said, I suggest we have a basket of ideas on professional issues we want to discuss and report about. Let's see. Media entrepreneurship, Loretta is saying, is a great idea, especially in the backdrop of the impact of Corona in the media sector. Paul, you had this idea for women in Kenya who are mentoring, maybe to share some of our podcast episodes with mentees. Some of the interviews may be of interest while others are not, but yeah, we do have a good list of podcasts.
Yeah, I'm wondering, this is great and helpful feedback. And so I'm taking notes on it, and let's make sure, Melissa, that we copy the comments and put them in an email or a Word doc as well. But one thought I'm wondering about as we're listening and chatting about this, Melissa and I have been thinking about, once the pandemic ends and we have our training programs again, we want to build, a nice Dropbox kit, we call it, of resources, syllabi, assignments, materials around religion reporting that we can then use. And we want to develop a deeper bench of people who can teach on these topics in our programs. And so, maybe one thing we could try to do is invite some speakers who are leaders or experts or really talented on different parts of journalism or religion reporting. So some of these monthly meetings, maybe we can have a guest speaker and we record it on Zoom, and maybe we make sure we've got an Ethernet connection, Melissa, so we don't have any shaking on the Wi-Fi or whatever of the host. And then we record it And those who are live can ask questions and learn. And then the recording we can then post on our YouTube channel and on our TMP page so other people can encounter it later. And then we could also use those same recordings maybe in some of our trainings as we go along. But one example Melissa and I were chatting about recently is we have a new columnist on our site named Ryan Bird, who's a political science professor in Illinois. And he's also a pastor of an American Baptist church, I think, or, you know, he's a licensed minister. And he understands religion and politics, and he's a data scientist. So he does data journalism around religion. Very good, very quick. And so we've started doing little explainer videos with him about his columns. But we thought it would be cool to have him explain for like a whole hour sometime to our members how he uses data, how he crunches the data to tell stories or to, you know, to do analysis. That's the kind of thing that could be interesting. Another idea, several of you mentioned, you know, videos and YouTube. And one thing I was going to tell you, yesterday we heard, we had entered the editor and publisher, they have these EPI awards, and it's a pretty nice award for publications in the US. And we found out we won one last year for our culture coverage and our news coverage. And then this year, an ESPN, we won for the category of media under 1 million clicks a month, and ESPN last year won the category over 1 million. This year we were finalists in 3 categories, and we won in the category of video. I think it was investigative video or something. And the New Yorker, you know, the most important magazine I think in the United States, they won the category of video for over 1 million. We won the category of under 1 million. So the funny thing was, I wouldn't have expected that we would win in video. Our video and our story that won only had 200 views on YouTube. I think it had a lot more on Facebook. But you know, so we had a talented video producer working with us last year who did some good stuff, and he was a fellow. But it's kind of funny in the new age of media. Sometimes you're not even sure when you're doing good work or not. So that goes to say, like, I think we would love to hear from experts as well on how do you make video when you have, you know, low budget, limited resources. How do you make good video with sort of in those kinds of environments for YouTube and other platforms? So that we got some good ideas here. Melissa, what are your thoughts on what we've been hearing so far? And do you have any more questions you want to ask?
No, I think this is really exciting. I mean, so much the heart of what we do and what we love is connecting with you guys. So even in a time not with COVID, anytime we would leave you in your countries or at Pointer, we miss you all year long. We can't wait to return. So this is a great way for us to stay in contact, you know, regardless, to Paul's point, even after COVID, that we will have this great, you know, pool of resources for us. We come together, meet monthly, I think is just a great idea for us. I feel like there's definitely a need, and I feel like we can learn a lot from you, and we can, you know, give encouragement and training and tools to help you. So I'm excited. I think this is going to be really fun. We'll be in touch with more details on that, so we can figure out. I think, you know, this time might be good because it seems like everybody's awake, even if it's getting late for Jennifer. I know it's getting late for her, so
I'm still awake.
but you guys are doing good. So,
Thank you. I'm still at the studio.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So, but I'm excited, really excited. It's just such a blessing to see all of you. So we will be in touch about that. Yes, Leica.
Yes, I just want to share that about what is possible. We're talking about resources. Recently, I signed up for a course with Pointer. It was a 6 weeks program and had over 50 people from all over the world. I was the only one from Sub-Saharan Africa, and it was a great course in terms of about management, in terms of after pandemic. So just to say that there are many opportunities that we should be daring. This time, the opportunity for online is immeasurable to be able to access a lot of programs. So all these things we're talking about will be very useful. Even if you can't join real time, you can come back and watch the video of whatever we talk about. So it's very interesting.
Yes, great point, Leica. Thank you. No, this is wonderful. So we'll be in touch about that. I do want to make sure that you know tomorrow, we have been doing this 3-part series on, let's see, we've been doing a 3-part series that's been hosted by the Acton Institute and the Media Project, along with many other organizations, and Religion Unplugged. Tomorrow's lecture is going to be on reclaiming Christianity, connecting to its African roots. So Lisa Fields is going to be the one who's featured. She's the founder and president of an organization called the Jude 3 Project. This is going to be on at noon Eastern time on Facebook Live. It's going to be on the Religion Unplugged Facebook page. So if you are not following Religion Unplugged, be sure to go to Facebook, look up Religion Unplugged and follow that. And then tomorrow, right at noon, we're going to be in conversation with Lisa. And this has been a really fascinating series to focus on for us. And we've gotten a lot of good responses. So please feel free to share. There's, if you go to our Facebook page as well, the Media Project and Religion Unplugged, we have an invitation on there. So we really hope that you can join us for that tomorrow as well. Anything else, Paul? Any final?
Well, if we've got about 20 people, 25 people on here, and we have about 27 minutes left. Is there interest to go around and just hear for everybody from, like, ask a question, hear a 60-second response from everybody before we close, at least from those who can stay? Or what time are we going to end? I'm just wondering if there's any desire for more sort of reports or quick conversation here.
Yeah, if anybody would like to share more, something maybe you learned this week or other comments.
Again, it could be useful, you know, when we are talking about niche journalism, it could be very useful to speak about, you know, specialized media. Maybe this is something that I'm always thinking of my students, so that they could eventually, you know, some of them want to do sports, so some of them want to do whatever, but give them examples of what are the specialized medias in religions or podcasts or places where they could think that this is also not a market, but something that they could develop if they have the interest too. So having some examples of sites or medias or that could give them ideas, always useful in those times.
Maybe should we take that? This is good to hear. Why don't we say we could go around, anybody who wants to take 60 seconds to tell about something that's on your mind, something that we want to hear. How are you doing, really? You could talk about yourself, your family, your newsroom, or about like a trend or something on your mind that's interesting. Like, for example, I'll go first just to kick it off. I sent you a link about God and guns. Okay, some stories we've been doing a series about, like how Christian people in the U.S. are arming and trying to protect houses of worship because we've had so many attacks on houses of worship in the U.S. and around the world. And you know, we try to explain here, maybe is it good or is it not good? There's different theology around whether it's good to have lots of guns at church. But in the New York Times today, I was reading that our nation in the U.S. is so divided that many are rushing to arm themselves, and first-time gun buyers is way up. Both now people on the left, the political left, are also buying guns. So we're working on a story at Religion Unplugged about this, kind of a reverse angle of people who are not religious, who are left, but worried about all the people, conservatives on the right who have guns. And we have an elections 5 days away, as you know. And so there's real worries about violence, and you can't buy guns and ammunition for certain types of guns are sold out for the next year. So to me, that's something I'm watching, I'm interested in from a journalism standpoint and a religion standpoint. I'm a little bit, worried about as a human. So that's, feel free to popcorn around here. We like to hear how you're doing personally and what's on your mind. So let's open the floor a bit for that.
Okay, Sanjeev.
Yeah. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I'm just taking up from what Paul was talking about. It seems, focus of all news right now is the US away. Okay. And the fact of whether it's dump the Trump or whatever it is. I mean, the point is that I think America is a real divided nation as of now, isn't it? I mean, we have,
Yes.
and we have very much larger questions, and these larger in these larger questions, um, you know, the unity of different faiths and all really comes into play. The fact that African American, despite all the protests that have been happening for so many months over, yet another young guy has been shot on the streets by the police, and here is something, here is where, things look quite, I mean, really critical and serious. So, I mean, I think, okay, maybe coming back to my situation, since we said that we want to share how things have been going. So definitely it's a learning experience for everybody, the year 2020. And, just when we think, especially in New Delhi where I live, just when we think that, maybe this pandemic is under control, we find again that the numbers have gone up suddenly. I mean, like yesterday, there were 4,800 or 4,500 cases in a day only in the city of New Delhi. So, I mean, that uncertainty, it prevails. And I think there are, the world at large needs to focus on these very basic things of, preserving the earth and preserving whatever else, whatever we have left of it, I mean, because it's been, I mean, so in a way, I think we should all wish each other the best, and, do our very, I hope you guys have voted for one.
Yeah, it's an interesting time in the US, indeed.
Yeah, so anyway, I'll hand it over to others now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Yes, Lekan and Lucy were saying they'd like to get a pitching guide for RUP to know kind of, and really the thing is, as far as pitching for RUP is to email you and Megan. Any story ideas? Oh, wait, hold on, Paul, you're muted.
Oh, yes, you can pitch to us, but I do realize we have a document we started working on to give more guidance around pitches. We'll put it on the website and we'll send it out in our in 300 words email. And I hope all of you receive those emails from us. Let us know if you're not getting a monthly email from us in 300 words, so we can make sure we have your correct email address and that we have whatever other, that we're not going to your spam folder, etc. And of course, we try to also communicate through Facebook and WhatsApp, and many of you are on WhatsApp groups. So I hope ultimately you're all hearing from us when we send out materials.
Yeah, but once we get that guide, that'll be good. Just we'll get that document and get it to you guys with the kind of pitching guidelines.
Okay, I see Lucy is asking if there are tips for online coaching for college students.
Oh, Lucy, I need that.
Yes,
I need that.
I want to recommend that I subscribe to a Pointer Institute campus journalism college, whatever, dedicated newsletter. It's very useful. Every week you get a newsletter that is dedicated to college journalism, resources, ideas, and so many things. So if you check on Pointer, you'll find one.
Yes, that's a great point. Pointer's a really good resource as well. They're online courses. Yeah.
Dr. Paul, I saw yesterday that you mentioned that when it comes to pitching the news, we can also talk about music, right? So I'm thinking if the news that we can pitch to the RU only about musicians who have like big names, because like in Indonesia we have local musicians who also play like music about a local religion, about local belief. Is that worth pitching to the RU? I mean, like the coverage about their music and how their music plays big role in like the society.
I think we would like some stories like that. But, I think especially if you can connect it to, if you can write about them in a way that connects to religion and connects to why people outside of Indonesia might be interested in that artist, then that's great. And, if they have YouTube videos, we could embed those right in with the story or the interview. So we definitely want to be aware of music happening from different parts of the world, and artists who have some element of religious thinking in their artwork or their music.
So it has to be something that be impactful with the international work, right? Or might interest people outside Indonesia, for example.
I think so. I mean, one could say that probably Indonesians around the world might want to read about it, or people who like that kind of music maybe are from not just Indonesia but other places. So I think the key is thinking about the elements of that artist that connect with the broadest type of reader, like the people on this call. Would we want to what would interest us in hearing the music and learning about that particular person? Maybe Jennifer also has some insight on this question.
In fact, I was going to say, Paul, do you think it is necessary to bring in a faith angle into every single story that somebody, actually puts up to you and Megan?
We try to have, is there, some element of faith or religion?
Your own faith? I'm sorry, are we talking about your own faith?
More of really about the subject, if it's a politics story, or we try to see the religion angle that maybe the other rest of the media isn't seeing, or maybe sometimes they see it and so we highlight the same element. But for example, on music, Bob Dylan to me is an interesting artist, and maybe some of you follow Bob Dylan. At one point in his career, I mean, he was born Jewish in Minnesota, which is interesting in and of itself. And as a major folk singer and a Nobel Prize winner and an incredible writer of music and his books and stuff, and a painter, he's just an interesting person who's had a lot of impact, I think, on the US and other parts of the world. And he had a phase where he became an evangelical Christian and put out three or more albums about it. And so his last album, when it came out, I listened to it and I could hear Abrahamic themes, both from Judaism and Christianity in the music. And maybe some of the younger staff at Religion Unplugged don't care much about Bob Dylan, but I did. And so I knew a friend in Mississippi who's writing a book about Bob Dylan, and who, this guy knows enough about religion, is religious himself. So he did a review of that album, and it got a lot of traction for us on Reddit. And he didn't overdo it. He did a good job, I think, of seeing what others were saying about the album and the religion, and then using his own interpretation and knowledge of Bob Dylan's life and history and the lyrics. So we kind of look for that. We just want to see religion as it's lived. And I think because we don't publish so many stories, we only do 10 to 20 per week, Jennifer, it's pretty rare for us to publish something that has no connection to religion. We always want to look for where religion is somehow connected to the story.
That's a nice way of putting it, and that's a nice tip for everybody, really, if you're thinking of giving any kind of stories to Religion Unplugged. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for a good question.
Yeah, any other questions or thoughts or things to share?
Okay, just one more. I don't know whether this is peculiar to my country. One of the things I've noticed is that many journalists don't pay attention to their career. So we get absorbed in working, do all the work, and suddenly, like this time, people are doing their jobs. And when you ask people what they've been doing, they've just been working. So, and that's why one of the things I'm doing now is to find structured career development support for journalists, something that are good reminders, timelines for people, because we need journalists to remain in good, to be in good mind, so to say, to be able to do their job. So the point I'm talking about is journalists need to be reminded about career development, something that has to be very deliberate. Because we cover everybody, we report everybody, we see all the good in every other industry. But somehow our own industry is suffering. You know, like I said, it may be peculiar here, but if it's something that resonates with anybody, it's something that I think we should be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think you know, Likan, it's a good topic and a good question. And as I see it, the technology giant companies, especially in San Francisco Bay Area, I'm talking about Google, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, and a few others. Those companies have really disrupted a lot of industries, including our industry, and a lot of us are suffering. I think our industry is suffering, and you know, one interesting thing. I think in February we're going to host a discussion about antitrust measures. Washington, DC, and I know Europe is trying to figure out how do we regulate the tech companies, because the regulations that were put in place in the 1990s created these unintended consequences where the tech companies basically took all the ad money, cut out news organizations and other industries and really disrupted these organizations. So I think it's, you know, we need to, for our programming, both our week-long programs and our monthly, if we do these monthlies, to think about, it sounds like you guys are saying we need to help think through how can we be entrepreneurial, maybe also how can we think about and cover big technology and its impact on our societies, and how do journalists think about not just using the big tech platforms, but maybe how to understand what's happened with them, and maybe how our countries can regulate those companies in a way that's more fair to.
That would be great, Paul. We've been thinking that in your Congress, that discussion is being to get implemented, and some say that the only way to regulate is to break their economic model. No, these kind of stuff. But that would be a great discussion. I was sending to the chat. You know, we in Latin America, we are basically Christians are there, be Catholics or Protestant or whatever, but we don't have so many, you know, that fight with other religions. But I think everything, I was reading your article about guns in church, and I think that difficulty sometimes to how you live your faith, you know, between the theory or the gospel and the reality. So when you say, okay, we say no violence, but if someone goes, you know, to kill someone in my church, I have to be able to defend myself. How do you leave that? Though those are questions that are very important because they are part of everybody's life, you know. Like, and I was saying the problem, maybe not now, because we with the pandemic of COVID, things changed. Most Venezuelans, they try to walk back to Venezuela, which was extremely hard because all the borders were closed, and then now they're coming back. But before that, you know, when you had 1 million Venezuelans in Colombia, 800 or 900,000 in Peru, 400,000 in Ecuador, we had tensions, and between people sharing the same religion, that is, we were basically Christians. So that was not a problem, that was not an issue. But how do you live that when you know you have some people that have jobs that are not threatened, but others that are? So what do you do? How do you live your faith when at the same times, how do you say hi? How do you give a hand to people coming? When in the same time you say, oh, okay, but they have an obvious impact on the job market. That's, I mean, at the beginning they say no, but it's obvious. I mean, in Quito you were seeing Venezuelans everywhere and working well because they were they had masters, they had PhD, they have been doing a lot of things. So how do you live your faith, the fact that you should be welcoming those people that are fleeing from something terrible at home, but in the same times there is a moment where there are too many. So how do you live, these kind of difficulties to live what is the world, what is the reality? I think it's very important because it could help all of us to say, okay, and the same theme with the last text of the Pope, for example, about the nuclear weapons. It was very interesting, but at the same time, when you were reading that, you say, okay, basically, do we have the right to defend ourselves or no? And, someone who could explain the text. But I think it's very interesting. How do we live in the real world? Concretely, what do we do when when we feel that people that we should welcome are taking the jobs of our sons. Not easy. I mean, sometimes, you know, it's too easy to have a moralist point of view.
Yeah.
How do we leave that? That's interesting, I guess.
Yeah, Eric, and I see our friend Helen from Venezuela put a comment there in her email for you in the chat. I think you're right. We would love to have some coverage from Latin America about that kind of story. And Helen, I know, is on the call as well. I mean, I'm reading stories about Venezuela, and in the papers and sites I'm reading, I'm not reading as much about the religion element of the Venezuelan people and the migration patterns and the stuff that Eric's talking about. So if anybody on this call has ideas and pitches about it, we'd love to see some coverage, whether it's podcast, video, or text stories. And by the way, on that, one thought on this antitrust thing, you know, Washington is having a hard time regulating the big tech companies because of the political interests. They don't want to stop the innovation and the money that they're creating in this country. So I think one benefit is if we share some of these antitrust trends and background with our journalist friends in different parts of the world. To me, why that's important is your countries have their own ability to regulate American tech companies and to say, hey, this we're not allowing. We're gonna fine Twitter. We're going to block Facebook or whatever. And Europe is doing that already. China is doing that. And you have large populations in your countries and big, you know, I was on calls with Silicon Valley folks yesterday and the day before, and the way they think is, it boggles my mind, to be honest, sometimes. But your countries may have a better position to regulate or raise questions. You journalists in these countries may have a better position to do that in some ways than people in this country. So that's why I think that kind of big topic may be a good one to follow up on. I know Melissa has to go in a few minutes. So maybe is there any comments from anyone else or updates?
Yeah, maybe a quick one, Paul, just riding on what you said about silicon. Lekan pitched a very good story about the SARS and the situation in Nigeria. And again, once it gets published in RU and we pick it up and run in our various newspapers all over the world, I think it will help. In a little way, our common assault on this will really come in handy, sort of teamwork.
Absolutely. We are able to collaborate. We're doing it already, but we haven't even tapped the full potential of our ability as journalists to collaborate, I think, which is fantastic. Mm-hmm. And when Sanjeev was talking, I was remembering the special time when he was at Pointer with Dominique and Zafar, who was on our call.
Yes. Yeah.
And I remember Jennifer and Lucy knew some of them, recommended them, introduced us to them, and just that special time we had at a dinner. Melissa told her story, Zafar told his story, and the kind of bonds we've built are just incredible. And it's really so glad for Melissa again setting these programs up here so we could see each other and learn together this week. And I look forward tomorrow to our Facebook Live event, Melissa.
And I really like to thank Melissa and Paul for what they've done here, because this is almost like being at Pointer, Melissa. I mean, I know it's not in person, but it's good fun, I think, really, just to all of us meet like this, So what if it's on the screen? I love it.
Well, you know what I think is wonderful is we've had that time together in person. I think if we were strangers trying to form the same bond, it would be difficult. But because we've been with you, or at least I've heard about so many of you that I haven't met until now, but the ones that we were, the time that you had together at Pointer or just connecting or working together, the time that we had at Laji and Apji, our time in Indonesia, just all the bonds that we have because of that foundation, we're able to come together and kind of pick up where we left off, and I think that's what we think of what we could do through these virtual meetups. It's going to be really fun.
Thank you, Melissa.
All we're missing is the shuffleboard and the dolphins, right? Maybe a little more too.
I know, that was was good fun.
I'm sorry,
I'm an
but dolphins.
expert.
Did you saw dolphins?
Yes.
Well,
Yes,
you were
sir.
lucky because they didn't show in our case, but we saw pictures. Yeah.
We enjoy the dolphins too.
Ah,
The dolphins. Yes,
good.
we enjoy.
Well, I also want to thank Jennifer for being here. She's one of our board members and she has been here every day and it's late her time and she looks lovely as usual. And we so appreciate you being here, Jennifer. Thank you.
Yes.
My pleasure. I made sure I slept this afternoon so that I'd stay awake.
Okay. Well, guys, we will be in touch, but don't forget tomorrow, Facebook Live on Religion Unplugged. It'll be starting almost exactly this time tomorrow. So noon Eastern time tomorrow. So please join us. It'll be a really good conversation with Lisa Fields.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Be
you.
well, everyone in the East.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Paul. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for all of you. Nice to
Bye,
see
bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you. It was rewarding. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, guys.
From Charles. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thanks,
Everyone.
Hertha, for being here.
God bless you and family.
Okay.
Bye.
Be in touch.
Yeah, sure.
Bye, y'all. Much love.